In the shadowed parking garage of Manhattan's most ruthless corporate empire, a single whispered command from a CEO worth $500 million would alter 2 lives forever. Take me home, or you're fired. But Louis Ryan, a widowed father who'd learned to read terror in his son's silences, heard the fracture in her voice immediately. The trembling breath masked as authority. The predatory figure was watching from across the concrete expanse with calculating patience. This wasn't seduction. This wasn't a power game. This was a woman trapped in plain sight, weaponizing the only tool she had left, her position, to plead for rescue. What Louis didn't know yet was that saving Kathleen Perry would shatter the fragile equilibrium he'd built for his son and give him back something he thought he'd buried with his wife. If you want to see how a single father's quiet courage transforms a CEO's fortress of control, stay until the end of this story. And please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story reaches across the globe. The fluorescent lights of Perry Enterprises' operations floor had long since dimmed for the evening, leaving only the pale glow of Louis Ryan's monitor to illuminate the scattered evidence of his fractured existence. Coffee mugs formed a timeline across his desk. Morning's optimistic brew, afternoon's survival fuel, evening's grim necessity. His son's construction paper card hung on his cubicle wall, the edges curling slightly. A crayon-scrawled message in uneven letters, "Daddy, you're my hero," surrounded by lopsided hearts in purple. One heart labeled, "Me," another labeled, "You," and a third, smaller and fainter, labeled, "Mommy," floating above the others like a memory refusing to settle. Louis checked his phone. 8:52 p.m. Little Star's daycare closed at 9:15, and Ms. Rodriguez had already called once. He could still hear her gentle voice on the voicemail, "Nathan's asking for you, Mr. Ryan." For words that carried the weight of every promise he'd made at Sarah's bedside 23 months ago, when cancer had turned his world into a before and after that his 6-year-old son was still trying to navigate with the emotional tools of a child. His fingers moved across the keyboard with exhausted precision, finishing the cost-efficiency analysis that his director had casually mentioned needing by Monday morning. Never mind that Louis had spent his lunch break on the phone with Nathan's school counselor about anxiety attacks during recess, or that he'd arrived at 6 a.m. to compensate for yesterday's emergency dentist appointment. In the cold arithmetic of Perry Enterprises, dedication was measured in deliverables and availability, not in the invisible architecture of single parenthood he constructed daily to keep his son from drowning in grief. "Still grinding, Ryan?" The voice cut through his concentration. Marcus Chen, senior operations analyst and unofficial guardian of the unspoken rules about commitment and career trajectory. His watch probably cost more than Louis's monthly rent in Brooklyn. Just wrapping the meridian analysis, Louis replied without looking up, saving his document with the muscle memory of someone who'd learned that technology failed at the most critical moments. Client meeting ran late. Marcus's tone carried the particular satisfaction of someone whose Friday nights involved steakhouses and networking, not bedtime stories and laundry. Something like that. Louis shut down his computer and grabbed his jacket, the same navy blazer he'd worn to Sarah's funeral, now with a small permanent crease where Nathan had buried his face during the service, sobbing that he wanted Mommy to wake up. He could feel Marcus watching him, cataloging this moment for future reference. In the 23 months since Sarah's death, Louis had learned to navigate the invisible currents of corporate judgment. The sympathetic expressions had lasted perhaps 8 weeks. Then came the shift. The declining happy hours became evidence of insufficient ambition. The early departures for parent-teacher conferences transformed into whispered questions about his commitment to the team. But Louis had stopped caring about whispered questions around the same time he'd learned to identify the difference between Nathan's bad dreams and his panic attacks. The hyperventilating at 3 a.m., the small hands clutching his shirt, the terrified whispers, "Daddy, what if you disappear too?" He'd become fluent in the language of unspoken fear, expert at reading what people were too afraid to say aloud. The elevator descended through Perry Enterprises' 42 floors in silence. Louis watched the numbers fall, each one marking another tier of the corporate hierarchy he'd once imagined climbing. Operations manager, senior manager, director, vice president. The carefully mapped trajectory of a man who believed competence and consistency were enough. That was before he'd learned the true cost of ambition. The overtime Sarah had worked to support his career advancement, the family dinners postponed, the accumulated moments of presence that could never be reclaimed. The hours he'd spent at a conference in Boston while Sarah's cancer suddenly accelerated, the phone call that came too late, the hospital room he'd reached 15 minutes after her final breath. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, all polished granite and steel, and the particular hush of expensive architecture. Louis had exactly 13 minutes to catch the Q train, collect Nathan, and avoid Ms. Rodriguez's increasingly pointed observations about work-life balance and a child's need for routine. Then he saw Kathleen Perry. She stood near the corridor leading to the executive parking garage, surrounded by a small group of vice presidents in evening attire, her presence commanding attention with the effortless authority of someone accustomed to being the most formidable person in any room. CEO of Perry Enterprises, architect of the company's transformation from family-owned regional firm to international conglomerate, and, according to Fortune, one of the most feared executives in Manhattan. Louis had seen her perhaps 4 times in the 3 years he'd worked here, always at a distance that maintained the necessary separation between corporate royalty and the operational workforce. Tonight she wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than his car, her blonde hair pulled back in the severe style that had become her trademark. But something was wrong. Louis saw it in the microsecond before she turned away. The rigidity in her shoulders wasn't confidence but control. The way her hand gripped her briefcase with white-knuckled intensity. And most telling, the man standing 30 feet behind her in the shadows of the garage entrance, watching her with the focused stillness of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Louis's phone buzzed. Ms. Rodriguez again. He should leave. He should run for the subway, collect his son, and maintain the careful boundaries he'd built around their fragile stability. But he'd spent 23 months learning to recognize silent terror. He'd become an expert at hearing what people couldn't say aloud, the way Nathan whispered, "I'm fine," when nightmares stole his sleep, the tremor beneath brave words. And as Kathleen Perry's eyes found his across the lobby, desperate, calculating, drowning, Louis understood that he was about to make a choice that would change everything. The man in the shadows took a step forward. Louis moved toward the garage. The parking garage stretched before Louis like a concrete cavern, the overhead lights casting pools of yellow that did nothing to soften the shadows between support columns. His footsteps echoed against the walls as he descended the ramp, each step measured against the time bleeding away. Nathan would be the last child at daycare again, the one whose father cut it too close, the one Ms. Rodriguez had to comfort when the other parents arrived on time. Louis's car sat in its usual spot on level B3, far from the executive spaces near the elevator. He'd parked there at 5:47 this morning, arriving in darkness to finish the meridian analysis before the day's inevitable interruptions. His thermos still sat in the cup holder, empty since noon. The protein bar he'd bought for lunch remained unopened in his briefcase, forgotten when the school counselor called. He was fishing for his keys when he heard it. A voice, low and masculine, with the particular edge of controlled anger that Louis had learned to recognize in the months after Sarah's death, when grief made him hypersensitive to every variation of human emotion. "You can't ignore me forever, Kathleen." Louis froze, his hand halfway into his pocket. 3 rows over, partially hidden by a concrete support pillar, he could see them. Kathleen Perry stood with her back nearly against a silver Mercedes, her briefcase held across her body like a shield. The man facing her was tall, expensively dressed, with the kind of presence that commanded space. He stood close enough that she couldn't move without pushing past him, and everything about his posture suggested he knew it. "We've had this conversation, Victor." Kathleen's voice was steady, but Louis caught the microscopic tremor beneath the words. He'd heard that same false calm in Nathan's voice when his son tried to convince him the nightmares had stopped. My attorney has been very clear about the boundaries. Boundaries. Victor's laugh was soft, bitter. You think a piece of paper changes what we built together? What do you owe me? Louis should leave. This was executive territory, private drama far above his pay grade. Nathan was waiting. Ms. Rodriguez was watching the clock. The careful routine he'd constructed depended on him maintaining the schedule, staying in his lane, not getting involved in situations that could jeopardize the fragile stability he'd built. But Kathleen's hand was shaking. Louis could see it from 3 rows away, the way her fingers gripped the briefcase handle with white-knuckled intensity. He could see the calculation in Victor's stance, the way he'd positioned himself to block her path to the elevator, to trap her in plain sight in a parking garage where anyone could witness but few would intervene. He thought of Sarah in the hospital bed, how the nurse had told him she'd ask for him in those final minutes. How she'd waited as long as she could. If he'd just left the conference session 15 minutes earlier, if he'd just trusted his instinct that something was wrong, he could have held her hand one last time. Louis's keys bit into his palm as his fingers closed around them. He couldn't ignore someone drowning again. Not when he'd learned to recognize the signs. Not when he'd become fluent in the language of silent terror. He walked toward them, his heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears, fully aware he was about to step into something that could destroy everything he'd carefully rebuilt. But Nathan's voice echoed in his memory from last week, when they'd watched a superhero movie together. Daddy, would you help someone even if it was scary? Every time, Louis had promised. Now he had to prove it. Kathleen. Louis kept his voice casual, friendly, as if he'd just noticed her across a coffee shop instead of witnessing her trapped in a concrete corner. Sorry, I'm late. Traffic on the queue was a nightmare. The effect was immediate. Victor turned, his expression shifting from controlled menace to sharp assessment in the space of a heartbeat. Kathleen's eyes met Louis's, and he saw the flash of confusion, then desperate calculation, then something that looked almost like relief. And you are? Victor's voice carried the particular condescension of someone accustomed to evaluating and dismissing people based on the cost of their clothing. His gaze traveled over Louis's off-the-rack blazer, the scuffed briefcase, and the subway card visible in his shirt pocket. Louis extended his hand, forcing Victor to either accept it or reveal his hostility. Louis Ryan. Operations. You must be one of Kathleen's colleagues. Victor didn't take the hand. Victor Ashford. I'm Kathleen's ex-husband. The emphasis on the ex-husband carried a challenge, a statement of territorial claim that the divorce papers hadn't actually settled. Louis saw Kathleen's jaw tighten, saw the way her breathing had become carefully controlled, the way someone breathes when they're trying not to show panic. Louis and I have been seeing each other, Kathleen said, her voice suddenly stronger, the executive authority returning as if she'd found solid ground beneath her feet. For several weeks now. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Louis could feel the weight of the lie, could calculate exactly what he was risking. His job security. He maintained invisibility in the corporate hierarchy. The stable income that kept Nathan in daycare, that paid for the therapy sessions, that maintained the fragile routine holding his son together. But he thought of Sarah's final minutes, of the choice he hadn't made fast enough, of the 15 minutes that haunted every decision since. 6 weeks this Tuesday, Louis said, meeting Victor's stare with the quiet steadiness he'd learned from 2 years of convincing Nathan that everything would be okay even when he wasn't sure himself. We've been keeping it private. You know how corporate environments can be about relationships between different levels. Victor's expression hardened into something ugly. You're telling me that Kathleen Perry, CEO of a billion-dollar enterprise, is dating an operations analyst who takes the subway home? I'm telling you, Kathleen interjected, her voice carrying the steel that had built Perry Enterprises into what it was, that my personal life stopped being your concern the day the divorce was finalized. Louis, we should go. We have reservations. She moved toward Louis with the controlled grace of someone who'd learned not to show weakness, but her hand found his arm with unmistakable desperation. Her fingers were ice cold through his jacket sleeve. This isn't over, Victor said quietly, his voice carrying a promise that made the temperature in the garage seem to drop. Actually, Louis replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his own voice, it is. He guided Kathleen toward his car, feeling Victor's stare burning into his back, fully aware that he'd just detonated his entire carefully constructed life for a woman he'd spoken to exactly twice before tonight. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Ms. Rodriguez. Nathan is asking for him. Louis unlocked his decade-old Honda, and Kathleen Perry, CEO, worth $500 million, climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation. Behind them, Victor Ashford stood motionless in the shadows, watching. Louis's hands shook as he turned the key in the ignition. Honda's engine coughed to life with the familiar rattle that always made him worry about repair costs he couldn't afford. Beside him, Kathleen Perry sat perfectly still, her breathing shallow and rapid in a way that Louis recognized immediately from Nathan's panic attacks. Just breathe, he said quietly, pulling out of the parking space with deliberate calm. In through your nose, out through your mouth. 4 counts each. She followed the instruction automatically, and Louis wondered how many times she'd had to coach herself through moments like this, alone in conference rooms or executive bathrooms, maintaining the facade of unshakable control. They made it to the garage exit before her composure shattered. I'm sorry. Her voice cracked on the second word. God, I'm so sorry. I just saw you, and I panicked, and I knew if I didn't get away from him right then. She pressed her palms against her eyes, her shoulders rigid with the effort of holding herself together. You probably have a family waiting. A wife. I just destroyed your evening and possibly your career, and I didn't even ask. My wife died 23 months ago, Louis said, keeping his eyes on the traffic merging onto the street. It's just my son. And you didn't destroy anything. You asked for help. The silence that followed felt heavy with everything unsaid. Louis waited, giving her space the way he'd learned to give Nathan space when the tears came without warning. He's been following me for months. Kathleen's voice was steadier now, clinical, as if she were presenting a quarterly report on her own stalking. Victor. Since the divorce was finalized in March. At first, it was flowers delivered to my office. Then he started showing up at restaurants where I had dinner meetings. Then the gifts. A necklace I'd admired during our marriage. Photos of us from our honeymoon with notes about how much he missed me. Last week, he was waiting outside my apartment building at 6 in the morning. Louis felt anger coiling in his chest. Have you reported it? To whom? The bitterness in her laugh was sharp enough to cut. Victor Ashford is one of the most connected real estate developers in Manhattan. His lawyers play golf with judges. His business partners sit on the boards of half the companies in this city. And I'm a woman CEO who's already called cold, difficult, and emotionless by half the industry. If I report that my ex-husband sends me flowers and wants to talk, I'm hysterical. Unstable. Letting personal drama interfere with my judgment. Louis's phone buzzed again. He pulled over, ignoring the honk from the car behind them, and dialed Ms. Rodriguez. I'm so sorry, he said when she answered. I have an emergency situation. Can you possibly stay with Nathan for another 2 hours? I'll pay double. Ms. Rodriguez's sigh carried understanding and resignation in equal measure. He's worried about you, Mr. Ryan. He thinks something bad happened. Tell him I'm helping someone who needed me. Tell him I'll be home soon with his favorite pizza. And tell him I love him. He ended the call and looked at Kathleen. Really looked at her. The CEO's armor was gone, leaving someone exhausted, frightened, and alone. My apartment is in Brooklyn, Louis said. Victor Ashford wouldn't think to look for you there in a million years. It's not much, but it's safe. We can figure out what to do next. Kathleen stared at him, and Lewis saw the moment she chose to trust a stranger over her own carefully constructed defenses. Okay, she whispered. Lewis pulled back into traffic, heading toward the bridge, carrying a woman worth $500 million toward his modest apartment, where Nathan's cereal bowl still sat in the sink from this morning. Ms. Rodriguez lived 3 blocks from Lewis's apartment, close enough that Nathan could walk there after school on the days when Lewis's meetings ran late. She opened the door before Lewis could knock, her expression carrying the particular concern of someone who'd witnessed too many of his near-miss pickups. "He's in the living room," she said quietly. "He was crying about 20 minutes ago. Worried something happened to you." Guilt twisted in Lewis's chest as he stepped inside. Nathan sat on Ms. Rodriguez's couch, still wearing his Spider-Man backpack, his face blotchy from tears. When he saw Lewis, his whole body seemed to unlock. "Daddy!" He launched himself across the room, and Lewis caught him, breathing in the familiar smell of apple juice and playground dirt. "I'm here, buddy. I'm sorry I was late. I had to help someone who needed me." Nathan pulled back, his 6-year-old face serious with the weight of questions he'd learned to ask since Sarah died. "Are you okay? You're not sick?" "I'm fine. Completely fine." Lewis smoothed Nathan's hair, the same dark brown as Sarah's had been. "Actually, I need to tell you something. I have a friend with me. Her name is Kathleen, and she's having a hard day. She's going to come to our apartment for a little while. Is that okay?" Nathan's eyes widened with the cautious hope of a child who desperately wanted to believe good things could still happen. "Like a playdate?" "Sort of. She just needs somewhere quiet to be safe." They collected Nathan's things and walked back to the apartment, Nathan's small hand in Lewis's, chattering about his day at school with the nervous energy that meant he was still processing his earlier fear. Lewis gave Kathleen his keys before they went up, offering her the chance to compose herself before meeting his son. When they entered the apartment 15 minutes later, Lewis found Kathleen sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, still wearing her expensive suit but with her shoes off and her hair falling loose from its severe style. She was examining Nathan's collection of picture books, arranged in careful piles by color. She looked up as they entered, and Lewis saw her trying to reconstruct the executive armor, trying to become the intimidating CEO who could handle a 6-year-old scrutiny. But Nathan had spent 2 years learning to read emotions adults tried to hide. He saw past the attempt at composure immediately. He walked straight to Kathleen, clutching the stuffed elephant he'd carried since he was 3, the one Sarah had given him the week before she died. Without a word, he held it out to her. "His name is Humphrey," Nathan said solemnly. "He helps when you're scared. Daddy says everyone needs something soft when they're scared." Kathleen stared at the worn gray elephant, at the child offering her comfort with the gravity of someone who understood fear intimately. Her carefully maintained composure cracked, and tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "Thank you," she whispered, taking Humphrey with trembling hands. "That's very kind." Nathan nodded, satisfied, then looked up at Lewis. "Can we have pizza now? You promised my favorite." Lewis met Kathleen's eyes over his son's head, saw her clutching the elephant like a lifeline, saw the wonder and grief and something almost like hope flickering across her face. She'd spent months being terrorized by a man who claimed to love her, months maintaining an impenetrable facade of control. And in 30 seconds, his 6-year-old son had given her what she'd been missing, permission to be afraid, and the simple grace of being seen. "Pizza it is, buddy," Lewis said, his voice rough. "Extra cheese." Kathleen wiped her eyes and smiled, still holding Humphrey against her chest. For the first time since the parking garage, she looked like someone who might actually be safe. Nathan fell asleep on the couch halfway through his second slice of pizza, his head resting against Kathleen's shoulder with the unconscious trust of a child who'd decided she was safe. Louis carried him to his bedroom, tucking him in with the practiced efficiency of 2 years of solo parenting. Humphrey the elephant sat on the pillow beside Nathan's head, returned to duty after his therapeutic loan. When Louis returned to the kitchen, Kathleen was washing their plates at the sink, her suit jacket draped over a chair, her sleeves rolled up. The sight was so incongruous, a CEO doing dishes in his cramped Brooklyn kitchen, that Louis almost laughed. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I need to do something." She dried her hands on the dish towel, then turned to face him. "Louis, why did you help me tonight?" The question hung in the small space between them, heavier than it should have been. Louis could have deflected, could have given her something simple and noble about doing the right thing. But something about the evening, the lies they'd told, the vulnerability she'd shown, the way his son had offered comfort to a stranger, demanded honesty. He sat down at the small kitchen table, the same one where he and Sarah had eaten breakfast on their last morning together, before he'd left for that conference in Boston. "My wife died 23 months ago," Louis began, his voice steady despite the familiar ache in his chest. "Aggressive breast cancer. She'd been in remission for 8 months, and I thought we were past the worst of it. I went to a conference. Operations management is completely routine. Sarah insisted I go, said it was important for my career." Kathleen sat down across from him, silent, listening with the focused attention of someone who understood that some stories couldn't be rushed. The second day of the conference, she collapsed at work. By the time they got her to the hospital, the doctors knew. The cancer had spread to her brain. They called me at 2:30 in the afternoon. I was in a session about supply chain optimization. The bitter irony of that detail never faded. I left immediately. Drove straight to the hospital. 2 hours in traffic that felt like 2 years. His hands were trembling now. He pressed them flat against the table. I got there at 4:47. She died at 4:32. 15 minutes. The nurse told me Sarah had been asking for me. That she'd held on as long as she could. Louis's voice cracked. I was sitting in a conference room learning about inventory management while my wife was dying, asking for me. And I got there 15 minutes too late to hold her hand. Too late to tell her I loved her. Too late to say goodbye. The silence that followed felt infinite. Louis couldn't look at Kathleen, couldn't bear to see pity or discomfort in her eyes. Since then, I've become an expert at reading fear, he continued quietly. Nathan has panic attacks. Nightmares. He's terrified I'll disappear too. I've learned to hear what people don't say out loud, the way he whispers, "I'm fine," when he's breaking inside. He finally met Kathleen's gaze. When I saw you in that garage, when I heard your voice, I recognized it immediately. That specific terror of someone drowning in plain sight. And I couldn't, his voice broke completely. I couldn't walk away from someone crying for help again. I couldn't fail to act when it mattered. Even if it costs me everything. Kathleen reached across the table and took his hand, her grip firm and sure. You didn't fail her, Louis, she said softly. And you saved me tonight. In the dim light of his kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his small, carefully rebuilt life, Louis let himself believe, for just a moment, that maybe she was right. Kathleen's phone started buzzing at 10:30, vibrating against the kitchen table with the insistence of something that wouldn't be ignored. She glanced at the screen, and her expression hardened. Victor? Louis asked. She nodded, silencing the call. 20 seconds later, it buzzed again. Then again. By the fourth call, Louis could see the tension returning to her shoulders, the careful control she'd let slip beginning to reconstruct itself. He's not going to stop, she said quietly. He never stops. Tomorrow he'll show up at my apartment building. Or at the office. He'll send flowers with notes about tonight, about how he saw me leave with you, about how I'm making a mistake. He'll escalate until I have to acknowledge him. The phone buzzed again. This time a text. Then another. The screen lit up with a preview. Lewis could read from across the table. You think an operations analyst can protect you? You think I don't know exactly who Lewis Ryan is? Lewis felt ice slide down his spine. Victor had already looked him up. Already knew where he worked, probably where he lived. The danger he'd stepped into wasn't contained to one evening in a parking garage. We need a better plan, Lewis said, his mind racing through possibilities and discarding each one as insufficient. A single night's protection meant nothing if Victor could simply wait him out, if tomorrow Kathleen returned to her life and Victor resumed his campaign of controlled terror. There is no plan. Kathleen's voice carried defeat. I go back to my apartment, hire better security, document everything, and hope that eventually I have enough evidence for a restraining order that he'll just ignore anyway. And you go back to your life and pretend tonight never happened before Victor decides to make you a target too. Lewis thought of Nathan sleeping in the next room, thought of the fragile stability that defined their existence, thought of everything he should protect by walking away from this right now. Then he thought of Victor's predatory patience in that parking garage. Of Kathleen's trembling hands. Of the 15 minutes that had taught him what mattered. What if we don't stop? Lewis said. Kathleen looked up sharply. What? The lie we told tonight. What if we keep telling it? Lewis leaned forward, the idea crystallizing even as he spoke. We make it public. We make it real enough that Victor can't dismiss it as a one-time intervention. The Perry Enterprises Charity Gala is in 3 weeks. Everyone who matters in Manhattan business will be there. If we attend together, if you introduce me as your partner in front of the board, the investors, the press, Victor would have to accept that you've moved on. Lewis, that's insane. You're talking about maintaining a fake relationship with your CEO. About putting yourself and Nathan in the spotlight of Manhattan society. About making yourself a permanent target for a man who has the resources to destroy your career, your reputation, everything you've built. I'm talking about making sure you're safe, Lewis countered. One night isn't enough. But 3 weeks of us being seen together, culminating in a very public appearance at the most visible event of the year. That's a statement Victor can't ignore. That's you moving forward in a way he can't terrorize away. Kathleen stared at him, and Lewis saw the war happening behind her eyes. The CEO is calculating risks against benefits. The woman who'd been alone with her fear for months suddenly offered an exit that seemed too good to be possible. You would do that? She whispered. Risk everything for someone you barely know? Lewis thought of Sarah's final minutes. Of Nathan's panic attacks. Of the parking garage and the moment he'd chosen to intervene instead of walking away. I already did, he said simply. Kathleen's phone buzzed again. Victor's name lit up the screen. She silenced it and met Lewis's eyes with something that looked almost like hope. Okay, she said. Let's do it. The call came at 7:15 Monday morning, while Lewis was making Nathan's lunch and trying to explain why Kathleen had stayed over on the couch without mentioning words like stalker or danger. Lewis Ryan, you magnificent bastard. Marcus Chen's voice carried equal parts disbelief and something that might have been grudging respect. You're dating Kathleen Perry? Our Kathleen Perry? The woman who made 3 VPs cry during last quarter's review? Lewis's stomach dropped. How did you? Security footage from Friday night. Someone in facilities saw you two leaving together, and by Saturday morning, it was all over the executive messaging channels. HR is having an absolute meltdown about disclosure requirements. Marcus laughed, sharp and incredulous. I thought you were just another single dad barely holding on. Turns out you're playing chess while the rest of us are playing checkers. Lewis ended the call feeling nauseous. It was happening faster than he'd anticipated. By the time he dropped Nathan at school, his phone had 3 more messages from colleagues, each one a variation of shock and speculation. By lunch, an email from HR requesting a meeting to discuss relationship disclosure protocols. The real blow came Tuesday afternoon. Ms. Rodriguez called while Louis was in a budget meeting, her voice carrying a gravity that made him step into the hallway despite Marcus's pointed look. "Mr. Ryan, I need to talk to you about Nathan." Louis's pulse spiked. "Is he okay?" "Physically, yes. But Louis, he's been talking about Kathleen non-stop. He asked me this morning if she's going to be his new mommy. If she's going to live with you. If she likes Spider-Man." Ms. Rodriguez paused, and Louis heard the careful concern of someone who'd watched him struggle through the worst period of his life. "I know it's not my place, but that boy has already lost one mother. He's attaching to this woman incredibly fast, and if this relationship doesn't work out." "I know," Louis said, his voice hoarse. "God, I know. Does she understand what's at stake? Does she understand that if she walks away, it's not just you who gets hurt?" Louis ended the call and stood in the empty hallway, feeling the full weight of what he'd done. He'd been so focused on protecting Kathleen, on not failing to act, that he hadn't fully calculated the cost to Nathan. His son, who still woke up crying for his mother, who'd learned to fear abandonment like other children feared monsters, was already weaving Kathleen into the family he desperately wanted to rebuild. That evening, after Nathan was in bed, Louis called Kathleen. They'd been texting throughout the day, coordinating stories, establishing timelines, but he hadn't heard her voice since Saturday morning. "We need to talk about Nathan," he said without preamble. The silence on the other end lasted 3 heartbeats too long. "He's getting attached," Kathleen said quietly. "It wasn't a question. My babysitter warned me today. He thinks you might be his new mom. He's 6 years old, and he's already building a family in his head that includes you, and if this ends badly," Louis's voice cracked. "I can't let him lose someone else. I can't put him through that again. So what are you saying?" Kathleen's voice was careful, controlled. "That we should stop. That 1 week is enough. I'm saying that if we do this, if we go to that gala and make this real to the world, we need to be honest about what happens after. We need boundaries that protect him. We need to decide if we're pretending or if we're actually trying," Kathleen finished. Louis closed his eyes, standing in his small kitchen where everything had changed 3 days ago. "Yeah," he whispered. "We need to decide that." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to voice. "I'll come over on Thursday," Kathleen finally said. "We'll talk. All 3 of us. Nathan deserves honesty." She hung up, and Louis stood alone, wondering if protecting one person meant failing another. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glittered with the calculated excess of Manhattan's elite. Crystal chandeliers refracted light across silk gowns and custom tuxedos, across faces Louis recognized from Forbes covers and business news segments. He'd borrowed the tuxedo from a former college roommate, and despite Kathleen's assurances that he looked fine, Louis felt like an imposter playing dress-up in a world designed to exclude him. Kathleen's hand rested in the crook of his elbow, her touch light but deliberate. She wore midnight blue, elegant and severe, her hair swept up to reveal the diamond earrings that probably cost more than his annual salary. They'd arrived together, walked the entry together, and Louis had felt the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation that stopped when they passed. "You're doing great," Kathleen murmured as they accepted champagne from a passing waiter. "Just breathe." Louis had been breathing. He'd been surviving the scrutiny of board members and investors, the thinly veiled assessments from people calculating whether he was a fortune hunter or genuine. He'd smiled through introductions, deflected intrusive questions about how they'd met, and pretended not to notice the judgment radiating from corners of the room. Then Victor Ashford appeared. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his tuxedo immaculate, his smile carrying the warmth of a shark circling prey. He positioned himself near the auction tables where donors congregated, ensuring maximum audience for whatever he planned. "Kathleen," Victor called out, his voice projecting just enough to draw attention. "What a beautiful couple you make. I don't believe I've had the pleasure of properly meeting your companion." The crowd shifted, sensing drama with the instinct of those accustomed to watching power plays unfold in public spaces. Kathleen's grip on Lewis's arm tightened, but Lewis felt something settle in his chest, the quiet steadiness he'd learned from 2 years of facing his son's nightmares without flinching. "Victor, I believe we've met," Lewis said evenly. "Lewis Ryan. Operations Management." "Of course." Victor's smile sharpened. "Though I must confess, when I heard Kathleen was dating someone from her own company, I pictured someone more senior. Tell me, Lewis, what exactly does an operations analyst bring to a relationship with one of the most powerful women in Manhattan?" The question landed like a slap, designed to expose Lewis as inadequate, inappropriate. Lewis felt the crowd's attention crystallize, felt Kathleen begin to formulate some diplomatic deflection. But then he thought of Nathan asking if Kathleen liked Spider-Man. Of her sitting on his floor reading picture books. Of the way she'd cried while holding a worn stuffed elephant. "I bring honesty," Lewis said quietly. "I bring a life where success isn't measured in quarterly earnings or board positions. I bring a son who teaches me every day that the bravest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it. And I bring the ability to recognize when someone is drowning, even when they're standing in a parking garage surrounded by luxury cars, being terrorized by someone who claims to love them." The silence that followed felt absolute. Victor's expression transformed from smugness to something dangerous. "You have no idea." "No." Kathleen's voice cut through the tension like steel. She stepped forward, positioning herself between Lewis and Victor, and when she spoke, her words carried to every corner of the gathering crowd. "You're right, Victor. Lewis isn't senior management. He doesn't have your connections or your wealth. But he did something you never managed in 7 years of marriage, he saw me. Not the CEO, not the portfolio, not the trophy. He saw a woman who needed help, and he helped her without calculating what it would cost him." She turned to face the crowd, her composure absolute, her voice steady with barely contained fury. "This man has been stalking me for months. Showing up at my home. Following me to meetings. Sending invasive gifts. Using his influence to intimidate me into silence. And when I finally found someone brave enough to stand with me, he came here tonight to humiliate him publicly." Victor's face went pale. Board members exchanged glances. Phones discreetly appeared, recording. "You want to know what Lewis brings to my life?" Kathleen's voice softened, became something raw and true. "He brings courage. He brings kindness. He brings a life that reminds me what actually matters." She turned back to Lewis, her eyes bright with tears she didn't try to hide, and kissed him. It wasn't performance. It wasn't a strategy. It was real, desperate and grateful and genuine, and Lewis kissed her back, tasting salt and champagne and the collapse of every careful boundary they'd constructed. When they finally pulled apart, Victor was gone, melted into the crowd that no longer wanted anything to do with him. "I think we just stopped pretending," Lewis whispered. Kathleen smiled through her tears. "I think we did." 6 weeks after the gala, Kathleen sat on Lewis's couch wearing jeans and one of his old college sweatshirts, her feet tucked underneath her, looking nothing like a CEO and everything like someone who belonged there. Nathan was at the kitchen table, tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration as he colored a picture of what he'd informed them was our family, 3 stick figures holding hands, one tall with yellow hair, one medium with dark hair, and one small with a superhero cape. Lewis brought coffee for himself and Kathleen, hot chocolate for Nathan, and settled into the armchair that had become his thinking spot during these quiet Sunday mornings that had somehow become routine. "Nathan, buddy, can you come here for a minute?" Lewis said gently. "Kathleen and I want to talk to you about something important." Nathan scrambled over, clutching his drawing, his expression shifting to the worried vigilance that still appeared too often for a 6-year-old. "Is someone leaving?" The question landed like a physical blow. Lewis glanced at Kathleen, saw his own pain reflected in her eyes. "No one's leaving," Kathleen said softly. "But we do need to talk about what's happening. About us." Nathan climbed onto the couch next to her, his small body pressed against her side in a gesture of trust that still made Lewis's chest ache. His son had been devastated once by loss. The risk they were taking felt enormous. "You know how I've been coming over a lot," Kathleen continued, her voice steady despite the emotion Lewis could read in every line of her posture. "How we've been having dinners together and I helped with your science project." Nathan nodded solemnly. "Your dad and I have fallen in love," she said simply. "Real love, not pretend. And we want to keep building this family together. But that's scary, isn't it? Because you already lost someone you loved very much." Nathan's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to forget Mommy." Lewis moved to the couch, kneeling in front of his son. "You will never forget Mommy. Ever. She's part of you, part of who you are. Loving Kathleen doesn't mean replacing Mommy or forgetting her. It means making space for new love while keeping Mommy right here." He touched Nathan's chest, over his heart. "Can I love both?" Nathan's voice was small, fragile with hope and fear. "You can love both," Kathleen said, tears streaming down her face now. "Your mom will always be your mom. I'm not trying to take her place. I'm just hoping to be someone new who loves you. If you'll let me." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, processing with the gravity of a child who'd learned too young that love and loss were intertwined. Then he held up his drawing. "I made you yellow hair," he said to Kathleen. "Because it's bright. Like you." Kathleen took the drawing with trembling hands, studying the 3 stick figures with the care someone might give a masterpiece. "It's perfect," she whispered. Lewis pulled them both close, his son and this woman who'd stumbled into their lives through desperation and transformed everything. It was messy and complicated and terrifying. There were no guarantees. Kathleen might decide corporate life and single-father domesticity were incompatible. Nathan might struggle with attachment and loss. They might fail spectacularly at building something real from the foundation of a lie. But Lewis had learned something in the parking garage that night, something his son had actually taught him through 2 years of nightmares and healing. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing a connection despite it. It was recognizing when someone needed you and refusing to walk away. It was building new love while honoring old loss. "So we're doing this?" Lewis asked quietly. "All of us?" Kathleen kissed the top of Nathan's head, then met Lewis's eyes with a smile that carried hope and terror and absolute certainty. "We're doing this," she said. Nathan squeezed between them, his small arms reaching to hold them both. "We're a family," he announced, as if his declaration made it true. And perhaps, Lewis thought, it did.